is, of course, a public comment that General Petraeus made, in which he said the United States and some NATO countries should lead some sort of an allied force, not a NATO force, but some sort of a coalition of the willing, to quote George W. Bush, on the ground in Ukraine against the Russians. And knowing Petraeus, as I know you do, I'm sure you know that he wouldn't have said something like that without having run it up the flagpole first. So first, what do you think militarily of what General Petraeus has offered? And secondly, who, since he's a civilian now, up the flagpole would he have run this past? Who else wants this? Does the Secretary of State actually expect his boss, the President of the United States, whose administration is tottering on the brink and whose physical existence is tottering on the brink, to put American troops on the ground? I'm asking you a lot all at once. I'll let you take those balls and run with them.
Well, on the first question, I think we have to regard this as having been a kind of trial balloon. In other words, Petraeus was given this material and told to run with it because the people in Washington are interested to see or hear what kind of a response, if any, they get from the American people. That's the first thing. Secondly, unfortunately, I do think there is serious planning going on about the use of U.S. forces in Ukraine. I think it's very dangerous. I think it's ill-conceived, but it's going on. Third, the mention of a coalition of the willing is a dead giveaway because NATO is not united on this issue. Most people in Europe are not interested in being dragged into a war with Russia. So when you ask the question, what is this coalition of the willing? Well, are we going to get some Romanian troops, Polish troops, perhaps, maybe some Lithuanians? It's hard to tell. Anybody else prepared to show up? I don't know how many British troops they can expect to get. I don't think the British could field 10 to 15,000 troops in any period of time that would be competent on the battlefield. The French, they're already overextended in Africa. So I don't know who else we're talking about. So this coalition of the willing, as it's termed, is another indicator. And then finally, why are we talking about this at all, Judge?
Right. Why? Because the globalists in the State Department want to put Putin out of business, and they think they can do it.
First, it's because Ukraine is devastated. It's losing. It's on the brink of extinction. The counterattacks that we saw over the last several months, it started out with 30, 40, 50,000 troops, then declined to perhaps 10,000, 12,000. They declined further to 3,000 to 5,000. And recently we've seen battalion-sized units, 500, 600, 700, actually trying to probe and walk through Russian defenses. They're running out of manpower that can fight. And in fact, the information I have is that the Polish soldiers in Ukrainian uniform, and we don't know how many there are. I've heard lots of estimates all the way up to and a little bit above 10,000. And then the so-called Foreign Legion that Ukraine has fielded, which may number 5,000 to 7,000 or less. Again, we don't know. That those formations are the only formations with any stomach for a serious attack in a major fight. So that's the other point. Now, finally, to go to yours. Yes, Judge, we have people in Washington who want a direct confrontation with Russia because they believe they can bully Russia. They believe they can compel the Russians to submit, that Mr. Zelensky can show up and accept their surrender. It's bizarre. There's no evidence for it. It's dangerous. It's stupid. But yes, they are there. And I think that characterizes the thinking at the top of the administration.
So Zelensky, who was all over the place in the media for 7 or 8 months, really hasn't made, two observations, hasn't made very many public appearances in the past month. So I offer to you the thought that maybe he knows that what you're saying is truthful and his days are numbered. The other observation I want to make is the storied American 101st Airborne is in Europe for the first time since World War II. They're in Romania. What are they doing in Romania?
Well, according to the reports, there are about 5,000 of them. This is a mix of light infantry and UH-60 aircraft. I don't know if they have a battalion of H-64D attack helicopters with them, but they're supposedly working with Romanian forces. Again, this looks like one wing or one leg of the coalition of the willing. Then the rest of the division is up in Poland, which is several hundred miles north. And there are all sorts of rumors on the internet, and people are saying, oh, well, they're going to fly in to Odessa and set up a blocking position to prevent the Russians from moving on Odessa. And they'll be reinforced. Okay, I find it hard to believe that we would be quite that stupid, because Odessa is very definitely on the menu for the Russians. It's a Russian city, a Russian-speaking city. It's never been Ukrainian. And they are going to retake it, just as they're going to retake Kharkov for the same reasons. And that's probably where they would stop normally. But if this happens, I don't think the outcome will be a positive one for the United States and its coalition of the willing. And then, of course, the question is, if we sustain heavy casualties and we are seen as losing, are we then going to turn to nuclear weapons? Because as I've said repeatedly on this thing, I have never seen any interest on the Russian side in the use of a nuclear weapon. I've seen nothing to indicate it. The statements that have been made were always made in response to us, response to anyone who questioned whether the Russians would respond if they were attacked with a nuclear weapon. And they made it very clear that they will. And this is the problem with this limited nuclear war business. But I think now the danger is we could walk into this. And as I tried to point out in that short 1,000-word op-ed, we're not ready. This is sort of get set and go in whether you're ready or not. And we're not ready. The infrastructure isn't there. The tons of ammunition are not on hand. The force sizes don't make any sense. I mean, we keep saying, well, the Russians were stupid when they went in, they made all these mistakes. Well, the Russians at least went in there with a goal of not killing fellow Orthodox Slavs. That was a goal. Didn't want to kill them. All right, that didn't quite work out as they'd hoped. But now we're talking about going in, and we have no such guidelines or constraints, but we don't have the forces. And we're now saying, well, the Russians are building forces. Well, there's a reason for that. This place is the size of Texas. If you don't have several 100,000 troops, you're not going to be able to dominate it. How are we going to do this? I think it's insane.
Something else that you alluded to in your fascinating 1,000-word op-ed to which you just made reference was the War Powers Resolution. In my view, a profoundly unconstitutional piece of legislation, but it's never been tested in the courts. And it means that we could all wake up some morning to find Joe Biden on television saying, by the way, last night, 50,000 American troops entered the fray in the Ukraine war, and there's nothing the Congress or anybody could do about it for 90 days. Then he reports on it, and they can stay another 90 days. Then he needs congressional approval. But for half a year, for 180 days, he has, in my view, the constitutional power that Madison and company expressly reserved for the Congress in his own hands. He can choose the target and wage the war, which makes him a prince. Madison was adamant about separating war-making power from war-waging power, but this terrible piece of legislation, which President Nixon vetoed because he thought it crimped his style rather than expanding his power, another argument for another time, gives Joe Biden that authority. Is this something we have to fear, that we wake up some morning and find out that while we all slept, 50,000 uniformed American troops, I'm just throwing that number out, entered the Ukraine-Russian war?
Yes. I think it's a real possibility now, much more so than any kind of nuclear exchange. I still do not believe that anyone in the White House is deranged enough to even consider such a thing. But I do think that this is a possibility. How much is it? 90%, 80%, 60%? I don't know. But I do know that after I'd written that op-ed piece, I received an awful lot of information from people on the inside telling me that I was dead right and on target, and then beginning to tell me the kinds of things that were under consideration. So yes, I think it's a possibility. Now, if we go back to this whole business, let's face it, certainly since FDR, I think we've lived in a world of presidential government. And that's one of the tragedies of the United States. We were founded as
Agreed.
And
There's no question about that the presidency, no matter who occupies it, whether it's Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan, or Harry Truman or Barack Obama, the presidency has expanded almost to the point of dictatorial powers. That George W. Bush and his successors all claim that somehow they can kill people. I mean, these are claims that even to FDR would have sounded alien. But I have heard nothing other than from you and our colleagues who've been critical of General Petraeus from his statement. Now, you say it may have been a trial balloon. Were they expecting tub thumping in support of it? Or were they expecting silence? Because no one wants to be the first one behind Petraeus to say it's time to put American troops in harm's way.
I think they're most interested to see if there is any public reaction. The people that govern in Washington are really accustomed to a quiescent, compliant public. I mean, how often do people take to the streets to object to things that we do overseas with the American military? The last time I remember any serious opposition to anything being done overseas was during the Vietnam War. And people say, well, see, that's because we had a draft. Not really. It took years before they finally went to the streets and objected to the Vietnam War. How long were we in Vietnam before anything happened? 3 years. Right. So the problem is that most Americans on any given day aren't interested. And so what you get as a consequence of this is what you have now. Right now, we have people at the top of this administration who are behaving like 3-year-old children who have found out that there are these things called electrical sockets, and they've got forks, and they're shoving forks into the electrical socket to see what happens. Well, one of them is going to be electrocuted, to be sure. Probably will be shocked by it at the least. That's where we are. That's what this idea of going into Ukraine is. It's dangerously stupid. You are pushing the fork into the electrical outlet.
Let's get back to the status of things on the ground. One of our viewers asks, isn't it true that Russia has lost territory? And if so, why? That is, lost territory that it had previously conquered and acquired.
Well, the only place that they have lost territory, as I understand it, that is significant in terms of square mileage was up near Kharkov. And that was an area where they only had 2,000 paramilitary police stiffened by some paratroopers. And they just said, look, this is wide open, flat terrain. It's not worth it. We can come back here whenever we want to. And they pulled out. The Ukrainians were then subject to punishing artillery, rocket fire, missiles, airstrikes, and lost 40% of the force that went in there. Now, over the last several weeks, we've had these little maneuvers, little attacks that for a while pushed forward, were then driven back. And what has been going on just within the last 24 hours is another one of those. But the real focus has been Kherson, which is critical to the Russians and critical to the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians have been expending every effort they can to try and gain control of it. They haven't. And they haven't driven the Russians off the bridgehead that they have west of the Dnieper River. And I keep hearing people report that. So I always go back and check. And what we have seen is Russian civilians were understandably evacuated. That's a good thing. We don't want them to be killed, just as the Ukrainians ought to evacuate Ukrainian civilians to avoid their deaths. But there has been no massive withdrawal of Russian forces anywhere. And I would simply suggest that these modest gains here or there have generally been reversed. And if they haven't been reversed, it's because there's no urgency to do so. And remember, behind these front lines right now, most Americans don't know this, there are groups of Russian forces with the best equipment available of between 50 and 80,000 men training behind these lines down in southern Ukraine, also behind the lines up in western Russia or Eastern Ukraine, and then up in Belarusia. So it looks like we see the evidence for three major axes as a minimum emerging, involving hundreds of thousands of troops on the attack. That's their focus. They're not worried about a few kilometers here or there of open, flat terrain.
What is, if you know, what is life like in the formerly Ukrainian areas now under Russian control? Is this like when the Nazis entered Paris and somehow the SS was working with the Paris police, and somehow the SS found compliant French politicians to run the machinery of city government? So who runs government? Who runs the schools? And is there day-to-day normal life and commercial activities going on in these four regions that a year ago were subject to Kyiv and now are subject to Moscow?
Well, the areas that they're currently under Russian control have been given huge quantities of food, medicine, humanitarian assistance, which was badly needed. And there are large numbers of engineering organizations down there trying to rebuild many of the towns and villages and farms and so forth that were destroyed in the war. Since most of the people consider themselves to be Russian, I have not seen evidence for any friction, nor has any really been reported, and that includes reports by foreign journalists who are not Russians. So I don't think you can compare that with the Second World War. I mean, if we were talking about what was it like to be Polish, White Russian, or Ukrainian, well, it's interesting because they have not sustained those kinds of casualties in the past. For them to lose 1,000 a day in one day, it would be interesting to know what the cause is. Did they indicate at all what had caused these deaths?
No, it's one of those short, Colonel, it's one of those short summary articles. It's no more than 2 paragraphs. It's like it was written on the fly. Maybe more is to come. If something breaks during the show, we'll pick it up and let you know. You and I discussed a piece in the Financial Times based on writing by reporters who are all over Europe that NATO's stockpiles are getting low and needing urgent replenishment. How could that be?
Oh, I think that's easily explained. First of all, even in the 1980s, when we were pouring enormous amounts of money into our military establishment, NATO was really conducting business as usual. Now, that was better than what we've seen since the early 1990s, but there was no sense of any imminent danger of war in Europe that justified massive production of equipment or munitions. Once the wall fell, so to say, you see that the German army was rapidly disbanded. The German government simply disarmed itself and fell into the hands of these combination of Greens and leftists who were convinced that that Fukuyama was right, that history had ended and there would be no further conflict.
So NATO, and you've been saying this, NATO is giving arms to Ukraine from its substance, not from its surplus, and its substance, whatever it may need for whatever purpose. The old days, the Russian bear, but whatever purpose, its substance is depleted significantly.
Oh, absolutely. And again, this reinforces another point, that the Europeans did not sign up for a war with Russia. When this whole business began, and I say business, I'm talking about going back to 2014 with the installation of the government that was essentially friendly to us, guided by people like Victoria Nuland and others from Washington. And then the subsequent massive buildup of the Ukrainian army, designed effectively for one purpose, to attack Russia, specifically not just to attack Russia, but to regain control of Crimea. So this was an unambiguously offensive force aimed at Russia. I think the Europeans looked at this and said, well, this won't really go anywhere. The Russians really don't want to fight, and the Russians are no longer armed as they once were. And what we're discovering is that they were not entirely wrong, that the Russian military was hardly prepared for a major war, which is why they ultimately went to the strategic pause, the economy of force. And they went to a war footing. They're now on a war footing. Their factories are running 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. they're not in any danger of running out of ammunitions or equipment or anything else. And they're turning out excellent equipment, brand new equipment in many cases. It's arriving very rapidly at the front. They now have a very large force, and it's getting larger every day. So I think the Europeans just never signed on for this. And the problem we have right now is that we grossly miscalculated on, the Russians. We don't really understand them. We didn't pay any attention to them. We're staring strategic defeat in the face.
Have our supplies been depleted, and
Absolutely.
are they in need of replenishment, the Americans, to the same extent that NATO's are?
Well, of course, you got to remember that if you look at something like the Javelin, a friend of mine at Raytheon told me that, and this was ultimately posted by Fox News in one of the articles, but a friend at Raytheon said, look, we've gone through almost 7 years of production of Javelins in Ukraine. It takes time to build these missiles, whether it's HIMARS or Raytheon's other products like NASAMS and so forth. All of these missiles are very complex, high-tech weapons. We've gone through our stockpiles very quickly, and we have no surge capacity, none. And that's something people don't understand. But the Russians have managed to very rapidly surge production. And the Europeans are very concerned about it. That's why inside NATO, behind closed doors, people are saying, this can't go on. You've got to end this, Washington. Everyone's at risk. We have nothing left. In fact, the whole tank issue is blowing up in everybody's faces because the tanks are simply not showing up. Suddenly, other European members are reluctant to commit their Leopard tanks. And if I were sitting in their shoes right now, I would feel the same way. Why would I send my armor over there? I might, in their minds, they say, well, once Ukraine is destroyed, we have to be able to defend ourselves. And I think they're right.
To this argument, late last week, General Christopher Cavoli, I don't know if you know him, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, an American general, was quoted as saying Ukraine's losses are, quote, out of proportion to NATO's expectations. Now, that's consistent with what you're saying, but I'm surprised to hear that from General Cavoli, unless this is the type of leak that's intended to acclimate the public to reality.
That could be. Cavoli is the Supreme Commander, Europe, and what he says is certainly going to have a huge impact in Europe. Most people in the United States won't pay any attention, but everybody in Europe will. And so in that sense, you could be right that he's signaling that this is not going to go on. We cannot sustain this. He's not going to come out and say it, but I think that's his message. Would
someone of General Cavoli's position, an American four-star, but commanding American and foreign troops to the extent that he's commanding them, you can tell me what that means, in Europe, have needed the permission of the State Department or the Defense Department or the West Wing to make a statement that profound?
Absolutely. It would have to have been vetted in the White House as well as with the Office of Secretary of Defense, and I suspect the Secretary of State.
He also used a phrase, and maybe this is military science 101, I don't know. Precision can beat mass. Can you tell us what that means?
Well, I did not necessarily use that.
No,
phrase.
You didn't use it. General Cavoli did.
Yeah. Cavoli is not wrong. What you need, though, is the following. Wars are won and have been won, certainly for the last century plus, by accurate, devastating firepower. Your ability to direct accurate, devastating firepower against the enemy at a place and time and space that makes his position hopeless. Let's put it that way. We have precision. Unfortunately for us, so do the Russians. So do the Chinese. This monopoly that we had for years on precision munitions is gone. Now what the Russians are demonstrating is that they understand that you need both. You want precision munitions, precision missiles, precision rockets, but you want huge quantities of them if you're going to win. So Cavoli is trying to sort of be on both sides of the equation. He said, well, precision can beat mass, yes, under certain circumstances. But if your opponent has precision and mass, probably not. And that's the case with Russia right now.
Wow. You and I also talked about some of the behavior of Ukrainian agents and recruiting officials. I don't know if they're military or not, lowering the conscription age to 16. Now, everywhere in the world, a 16-year-old boy is a boy, not a man, not a fully developed man, and too young for the military, but I guess not too young for Ukraine. You and I shared a video. I don't know how old this kid was, 14 or 15, was literally kidnapped right in front of his mother's eyes and shoved into a military truck. They were just walking down the street. What is this going to do for the morale of the people in Ukraine? Is it common or is it isolated? And has the conscription age in Ukraine, this is almost child abuse, been lowered to 16?
My impression is yes, it has. And there are multiple sources confirming that this is the case. And there's lots of evidence being posted by Ukrainians all the time about the true situation. There are pictures of Ukrainian soldiers that are obviously, 15, 16 years of age. So there's no doubt that this is going on. But I think this is part of the larger picture. The Russians went into this economy of force, and they maximized the effectiveness of their connectivity between space-based and terrestrial-based ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, assets above, and gun systems, rocket systems, missile systems. They've inflicted terrible casualties. Whole year groups of Ukrainian men are dead and are gone, have been annihilated. And at the same time, you have this much smaller population from which to draw on, as I talked about previously. There aren't 37 million people in Ukraine anymore. The areas that Zelensky controls, there are perhaps 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 million, which is roughly the size of the population of the Netherlands. That population is mostly male, I'm told, because lots of old men, women, and children have left the country. But still, the men that are there are not all able. Some of them are in advanced age, and lots of them are children. And so they're in desperation turning to this. This regime is at the end. It really is. But it's not going to give up. It's going to fight to the bitter end, and it's going to sacrifice whatever it can to stay in power.
But when will Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin and Jake Sullivan, the people that presumably are making these decisions, recognize what you just said, that the regime is at the end?
I think that for all intents and purposes, that message was delivered weeks ago from the Department of Defense to the White House, and it was rejected. Period.
Well, they're rejecting reality in deference to their political needs. Well, we'll hear that in the State of the Union tonight.
Well, I'm sure you'll hear an entirely erroneous picture. I mean, someone asked me today, how did we end up like this? I said, well, we've had 40 years of Cold War, at the end of which the Soviet Union fell apart and we emerged, if not victorious, then certainly healthy and well, and we avoided global war, which was our goal for 40 years. In just 1 year, we faced defeat in Ukraine through this proxy war, but more important, we're on the threshold of a potential confrontation with Russia, something that we worked for decades to avoid. So I guess the answer to your question, Judge, is it doesn't look good. We're not going to admit failure. No one will say they were wrong.
The Russians love anniversaries. February 24th, of course, is the anniversary of the beginning of this military incursion. From your sources, Colonel, does President Putin have his hundreds of thousands of reinforcements ready to pour in to eastern Ukraine and begin marching and killing and destroying on their way west?
Yes, they're ready. That's why I thought that by now they would have already pulled the string, so to say, and have moved north. But the shaping attacks that have been going on down in southern Ukraine have essentially set the Russians up for multiple axes of advance from the south, up towards Zaporozhye, up through the Bakhmut area, and further east up along the border with Russia. I don't know which one they're going to take. Maybe they'll take them all, but that has worked. Why they have not already attacked, who knows? I mean, one thing I'm sure Sorovikin realizes and Gerasimov realizes is that their strategy of enticing the Ukrainians to attack them relentlessly has worked. Ukraine has been bled white. And they may be saying, well, there's no reason to rush. We can wait another 3 or 4 days. Let's wait for additional ammunition. Let's wait for additional whatever it might be. Remember, logistics is important. And they want to push forward ammunition, medical support, more firepower, all of those kinds of things. And it may be they want to push some more forward. But the truth is they could go right now, and there's not much to stop them from going straight north and on the eastern side all the way to Kiev.
Have you seen any evidence of demoralization amongst the Ukrainian troops because of their vast casualties?
Anecdotally, you go on Telegram and you look at the things that are being posted in Ukrainian by Ukrainians, and yes, there's plenty of evidence for it. There's no question about that. Also, the hatred and hostility is growing for Zelensky, as more and more Ukrainians are blaming.
Just let me stop you. Is this hatred from the public, Ukrainian public, from the military, or both?
Well, I'm talking primarily about soldiers in the field, but that may also apply to the population. I just don't have access to that in Western Ukraine. I don't know what they think there. But soldier-wise, oh, absolutely. And they're also looking at very corrupt leadership. You know, there are comments coming in all the time. You're stuffing your pockets with cash, you and the generals, your corrupt leaders, and we're dying, by the bushel every other day. I mean, assignment to Bakhmut for the last couple of months has been essentially a death warrant, and everybody knows it.
Not too long ago, maybe 3 or 4 days ago, the former foreign minister of Poland revealed that at one point the Polish government was thinking of, I don't know how they would do this physically, militarily, and legally, partitioning Ukraine and considering the western part of Ukraine, the part largely untouched by the war that includes the capital, Kyiv, as a Polish protectorate, and thereby triggering Article 5, the obligation of all of NATO to defend Poland, if that part of Ukraine, a la Polish protectorate, were attacked by Russia. I mean, this just sounds to me crazy. It almost sounds like the justification Hitler used to combine Austria to Germany to protect Austria, even though the only people Austria needed to be protected from was him.
Although most Austrians disagreed, and they were quite happy to join the German state. I think Hitler's a bad comparison. Okay. I think a better comparison would be somebody like Stalin, the man that murdered 16 times the number of people Hitler ever encountered. I think Poland is another state in the region with unfinished business. You've got to go all the way back to the First World War and understand the Second World War was an extension of the First, and then all of the people in the region that were formerly part of Austria-Hungary, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, even the German imperial state or Prussia, all these places fell under Russian domination, Russian communist domination, and everyone was unhappy with it. Everyone hates it, and everyone felt betrayed. The Poles in particular, once they got out from under Soviet occupation and control, always envisioned a time when they would regain their former stature in Europe as a great power. So these kinds of thoughts and strategies have been around forever. The problem is, if they are seriously considering this, and they may be, I mean, it's hard for us to know, but nothing would surprise me. The Poles are romantics to the bitter end. If they think that by moving into Ukraine and claiming that they are acting in the name of NATO and Washington, that'll be the end of NATO. The Europeans will say, you've had it, you're on your own. We're not bankrolling your war to regain your empire against Russia.
Well, we already know that the president of Poland has said his goal would be to claim back Crimea. Now, that is an impossibility, and it's insanity.
Yeah, but you mean Ukrainian president, right?
No, the Polish president.
Oh, he
said,
wants to recapture Crimea?
yes, he wants American troops and his troops and Ukrainian troops to recapture Crimea. This is an impossibility, and I think you'd agree with me. It's insanity for him to say that.
Well, he's obviously on hallucinogenics of some kind that would make him billions of dollars if he could mass produce it. But no, I don't see any evidence for that happening. And again, look at everybody else involved. And I guess you have to make exceptions for people that live in northern Norway that think that might be great, who are on the edge of the West and are totally remote from reality. You may have some of those in England. I don't know. But everybody else on the continent of Europe will walk away from that. There's no chance of that. And that's the end of NATO. People just say, wait a minute. No, we're not joining this war on Russia. Russia is not the Soviet Union.
Is there any chance, no matter what Washington does, that Ukraine can win this war?
Well, of course.
Or that Putin can lose it?
No, of course not. No. Putin isn't going to lose anything. And so, somebody said, well, Putin is weakened and adrift. I said, you mean Joe Biden? They said, no, Putin. I said, no, Joe Biden, not Vladimir Putin. The Russians have a strategy. They know what they're doing. They're methodical. They're deliberate. They're effective. We don't. We never thought through the consequences of our actions. We're all sitting around here in Washington saying, oh, what do we do now? Ukrainians are going to lose. We can't have that. We've got to ship more over to them. What do we do? See, this has been my concern from day one, that then people who are rank amateurs are saying, well, we've got to do something. Maybe we can move into Western Ukraine, just out to Lvov, and set up a safe zone. I don't think it's going to go down very well with the Russians at this point. You can't tell your opponent, you must be humiliated. Your state must be dismembered, and your government must be destroyed. Then we will kindly accept your surrender and welcome you into the brotherhood of international globalism or something. But that's effectively what we've been saying. So if you're a Russian right now, you're looking at this and saying, we're just going to keep going until there's nobody left in Ukraine that opposes us. And I'm afraid that's the path they're on. And I don't see any evidence that we're going to try to seriously arrest it.
What will it take, in your mind, for Zelensky to call up Tony Blinken and say, let's start some back channel communications with the Russian foreign minister, because this can't go on much longer? Or is he not the type of rational person to do that? Or is Blinken not the type of person to accept that?
I think Blinken and the president would have to assure Zelensky that he and his inner circle will be flown immediately to Miami or Malibu or somewhere, and ensconced in wealthy homes and surroundings, and live comfortably for the rest of their lives, in which case he might do that. But otherwise, forget it.
All right. I want to switch gears just a little bit. Colonel, where on the planet is the largest gathering of Chinese intelligence agents outside of China?
Well, the largest concentration, let us say, of intelligence operation, in other words, the biggest operation outside of China,
yes,
with all of the technology and capability, is probably in Mexico. Probably on the outskirts of Mexico City.
And we obviously know at whom and at what those intelligence activities are aimed, if they're in Mexico.
And remember, the Soviet Union maintained its largest KGB operation in the world in Mexico, because Mexico was very friendly to the Soviets. I mean, these are old issues. Venezuela, Cuba, and Mexico were always pro-communist. They supported the communists and well, right now the Germans are providing 17 tanks, 3 from Portugal, 14 from Germany. That's not a significant number. They initially said they would end up with 88. That number continues to fall. I think for the Ukrainians, the mud would be a welcome respite.
Okay. Secretary Austin recently reinforced the Joe Biden mantra, "We'll be with you as long as it takes, and we'll get you as much ammo as you need." He's a little long-winded, but here he is.
Ukraine has been at this for a year, and so they have used a lot of artillery ammunition. We're going to do everything we can, working with our international partners, to ensure that we give them as much ammunition as quickly as possible.
as much ammunition as quickly as possible. I suppose that's so generic it could mean almost anything. But is there still enthusiasm, Colonel, as you perceive it from your sources, amongst the neocons on Capitol Hill to provide as much ammunition as possible, or do they see the handwriting on the wall that you've been warning about for a year?
I think they see the handwriting on the wall. But having said that, it's not a question of willingness at this stage. We simply don't have much ammunition to send. We've reached the point where we're rapidly running out of ammunition in our war stocks, and our factories cannot gear up fast enough to produce more at a desired rate. We don't have a surge capacity that we had 50 years ago. It doesn't exist for missiles, rockets, anything. So I think they're going to get something more than they've gotten, but not much. And it's not going to make much difference. On the other hand, as we've talked about before, the Russians, and I just had a conversation with someone who was in Moscow a couple of days ago, who tells me that the Russian General Staff is preparing for a 30-month war against NATO and the United States. All of their munitions factories, equipment factories are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So they are well stocked and they are prepared for the worst.
Well, guess who agrees with you on the depletion of our supplies? The Secretary General of NATO, General Stoltenberg. Here he is now.
The war in Ukraine is consuming an enormous amount of ammunition and depleting Allied stockpiles. The current rate of Ukraine's ammunition expenditure is many times higher than our current rate of production. This puts our defense industries under strain.
I wish that Secretary Austin had been there. Maybe he was somewhere else in the room. But the current rate, I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to think I memorized it. The current rate of Ukraine use is not twice, not three times. It's many times our ability to supply them. What does that tell you? It tells me that soon the Ukrainians will have nothing because NATO will have nothing with which to supply them. If you make $10 a day and you spend $15 a day, sooner or later, you have no cash.
Yes, the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. There's no question about it. And they'll have to fall back and regroup. If they don't, they'll simply be annihilated. And that might not even work either. We'll talk about that later. But the bottom line is, yes, the situation is dire. And the more desperate things become, the more ridiculous, in some cases, the claims are made by the Ukrainians and the West.
Do you have an opinion as to why General Stoltenberg would have said that, and if he would have said that without running it past his masters in Washington first?
No, I'm sure that they asked him to say it. Everybody knows it. It's an open secret. We're in the same boat as our European allies, but I don't think anybody in Washington wanted to make that admission. So they simply said, Secretary Stoltenberg, please, emphasize this point. Again, it's a statement of desperation. Please, please, please send whatever you have. We're running out. That's not a good thing.
General Milley, who was standing right next to Secretary Austin when he made the comments that we just ran a few minutes ago, you better be sitting down, Colonel, says Russia has lost. Take a listen.
NATO and this coalition has never been stronger, and Russia is now a global pariah, and the world remains inspired by Ukrainian bravery and resilience. In short, Russia has lost. They've lost strategically, operationally, and tactically, and they are paying an enormous price on the battlefield.
Your comments, Colonel.
Well, I think he's gotten down Jake Sullivan's talking points very well. Unfortunately, none of them, equate to reality. Russia is hardly a pariah. If it were a pariah, its economy would be in ruins, and its economy is going gangbusters because everybody in the world is ready to do business with Russia except us and some of our European allies. And even there are lots of cracks in that system. Otherwise, I think whatever they tell you about the Russians, you should just turn around and apply it to the Ukrainians. They talk about no morale, no leadership, poorly trained, all this sort of business. Doesn't apply to the Russians right now. It applies to Ukrainians. is very sad. It's a tragedy. And as you say, we've all seen this coming, but no one is willing to stand up, admit to it, and ask for talks with the Russians, sadly.
Do you see some sort of a shift going on here? I mean, these comments by General Milley were so forceful. They were literally 180 degrees from what he said 6 months ago before they slapped him on the wrist. I mean, what does he gain by saying this? I can't imagine that any serious professionals like you, or even the people, the other generals and colonels that work for him, would take seriously what he just said. And yet he said it before an international audience, and it was broadcast all over the world. That clip we just gave you was broadcast all over the world yesterday.
Well, let's be frank, Judge. This entire administration has lost a great deal of credibility in a whole range of areas over the last several months. Anything they say has to be viewed with great skepticism. General Milley has made it very clear that he is aligned with the left. He is part of this administration. He's going to say whatever they want him to say. End of discussion. Your concern about professional integrity and so forth doesn't really occur to him. He sees a different future. Remember that when these people retire, there are lots of wealthy left-wing oligarchs that will provide income for them and take care of them. The objective here is to meet that test. Please reward me for what I'm saying when I retire. That's all.
But you know him. Does he mean what he says, or is this an act intended to audition for the type of post-military retirement job he'd love to have, the one like his boss, Secretary Austin, had at Raytheon?
Well, I'd say it's the second, not the first. He's very definitely interested in the income. I don't know him personally. I have only met with him once, and I only know him by reputation, which was never very good in the Army. This is not somebody that was known for standing up and taking any tough positions under any circumstances. This was a man who was always willing to get the job done. Yes, sir. 3 bags full, as we say. So he's doing what he's done throughout his military career.
I mean, is this the type of person, is this the mentality and the character of human being, much like General Petraeus, that rises to the top in today's military?
Yes.
I mean,
definitely.
This is not Joe Biden's fault. This is culture that's been going on in the military for generations. The politicians rise, not necessarily the best generals.
Well, if you go back to the 1930s, look at the senior officers in the ranks of the French army, they were all very much like Petraeus and Milley. And of course, they failed miserably. And if you go and watch any of the documentaries, you'll have plenty of French officers that are younger, obviously, in many cases, or lower rank, will come on and say, well, the politicians liked easy commanders. They wanted lapdogs, people that would go along, people that don't brook opposition. And listen, that's what we have.
Tell us what you can about the Russian onslaught that's coming. We know that President Putin is giving what's described as a major speech on the 22nd of February. That's a week from today and 2 days before the anniversary of the commencement of hostilities. Would he be prepared to say, oh, by the way, there's 250,000 troops that just crossed the border? And if he were, would we know that ahead of time from intelligence sources, that a number that of human beings that massive is in one place at one time?
Well, Judge, I thought it was the 21st. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, I'm honestly going by a writer. We get hundreds and hundreds, sometimes thousands of messages per episode when you're on, and I'm going by what the writer has said.
Sure.
So
well, I think it's the 21st. What is happening right now is that we're seeing advances designed to effectively secure the axes of advance for the mobilized force that is being marshaled in the South. Now, what's the mobilized force? Well, we're looking at 250,000 right now of the Russian combat troops. Some of them are south and a little east of Zaporozhye when you look at the map. Others are just behind Bakhmut, which they are waiting for the Wagner military group to clean up. And then the other group is over near Liman, which is just east of Kharkov. And there, remember, we talked about 3 major concentrations, one in Western Russia, one down in the south, and one up in Belarus. The one in Belarus is sitting quietly, but is prepared, whatever comes. But these forces are going to move on at least 2, maybe 3 axes, but they're not going to move until it's completely clear. And if we look at the strikes that are going in right now, air, missile, rocket, artillery, they're stripping out all of the air defense radars and all the air defense artillery that's out there. So they want to be sure that they have a clear open field for their close air support, for their drones, for their rockets, for their missiles. Sometime in the next few days, we're going to see this gargantuan move north and west out of those 3 areas.
Let me just interrupt you. Gargantuan meaning with respect to the number of boots on the ground.
Yes.
Do troops literally walk miles on the ground, or
No,
are they
almost
transported?
everyone. No. Almost everyone will ride. Most of your infantry will be armored infantry, following behind armor, artillery strikes, and so forth. So no, people are not walking at all. Now, you've seen elite light infantry from the Russian side confront Ukrainians in places like Bakhmut, Ugledar, elsewhere. You're now going to see the thing change with the armored force moving forward because the terrain favors fields of fire and the kind of rolling open terrain that is good for armor. And this is perfect for the Russian way of warfare. That's what we're going to see. But it's going to be an incremental rollout. Remember, the majority of the forces the Russians are now moving forward are not bloodied. These are not people with lots of combat experience. On the contrary, many of them are fresh recruits or reservists that haven't seen much, but they are under the command of experienced combat officers. That's what counts. And thus far, they have been moved up to the line, exposed, brought back repeatedly, shifted back and forth. They've practiced their maneuvers. They're ready to go. So once these last remaining strong points in on the edge of the Donbass are gone, then we'll see them move. And their goal is everything east of the Dnieper River. In other words, everything from the Russian border to Kyiv.
Right. I want to make you laugh a little because we're talking about very serious stuff. So my former colleague, because he did work at Fox for a while, and then ABC, and then CNN, and now News Nation, Chris Cuomo is over in Ukraine, and I did what I thought was an excellent report, interviewing young Ukrainian either recruits or conscripts. Colonel, when I say young, I'm talking about 16 or 17 years old. In his report, he showed them doing serious military drills, and then he interviews one of them who speaks English, who tells him at his age, he has been to the front lines, he has seen blood and death, he's not afraid of it himself. Is there some age, I should know this, either internationally or legally in Ukraine, below which human beings cannot be put into battle?
Well, there should be, but there won't be, because it depends on how desperate the state is to survive. Right now, the Ukrainian state is desperate to survive. So they're going to reach down very, very low. But there are a couple of things here, Judge, that should be mentioned. Just because some of these kids may be 15, 16, 17, doesn't mean they can't be effective. In fact, there's a lot of history that suggests that they can be very lethal. We talk about our landings in Normandy, and when we faced the 2nd Waffen-SS Panzer Corps, we were complaining about all these veteran soldiers. In reality, more than 85% of the soldiers were under the age of 19. And they fought ferociously, and they inflicted 3 casualties for every one that they took.
These are German soldiers or American?
No, Germans against us and the British.
Us. Wow.
This was June of 1944 and July of 1944. Now, my point is this. Young soldiers that have never seen action are frequently much braver than those of us that have seen action, simply because we've survived some encounters. We know how lethal it is. They don't. So I believe the young man. But the sad truth of the matter is that no matter how brave you are, and no matter how much willpower you may possess, against overwhelming, accurate, devastating firepower, it's pointless.
All right,
your overwhelming, accurate, devastating firepower is what the Russians are going to bring to bear.
Your analysis is so astute. But the reason I said I was going to make you laugh is because of our person on the other side of this, Matt Van Dyke, who's physically present in Ukraine and who comes on once a week. He's the head of this group, Sons of Liberty International. They purport to be veterans, American military veterans who provide training to and non-lethal training to Ukrainian civilians and military. When I asked him about the morality of conscripting young people, he basically said it's a day in the park for them. And I got angry when he said that because I didn't believe it. But I want you to watch this clip, and then I look forward to your response.
How could someone refer to a draftee in the Ukraine military as having the time of his life?
That's
This
just
is
one
death and
example.
blood and gore.
Believe
It's not,
me,
it's not a summer resort.
in most cases, that is not the opinion of most conscripts. But the one conscript that I know, it gave him purpose. It gave him camaraderie. He was actually pleased that he was serving his country.
Colonel, this is worse than propaganda. This is utter bullshit.
Well, in defense of Mr. Van Dyke, he said this is the one conscript that he'd spoken to. So let's be a little understanding. He spoke to one. That may well have been the attitude of one conscript. But
Right.
frankly, towards the end of the Second World War, all of the European nations that were engaged in the fighting were running out of manpower. There wasn't much enthusiasm in the last 6 months of the war to go out and be killed after just a minimum training and equipping. So I have trouble with that. The other thing is that I know that the SBU, the NKVD equivalent on the Ukrainian side, is rounding up and sending deserters back to the front, and they've got lots and lots of deserters. Many of them are very young, and they have executed some of them as an object lesson. So I think things are much worse on the Ukrainian side than obviously Van Dyke is willing to admit, and many others will.
Let's switch gears to the balloon. The balloon that captured in the American imagination and people staring in the sky for hours 2 weekends ago.
Mm-hmm.
A person you and I know of, Gordon Chang, from time to time on Fox News, holds himself out as an expert on China, argues that the balloon flew over Malmstein Air Force Base, where approximately a third of America's land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles are stored. Then it flew near both the Warren and Minot Air Force bases, which house the remainder of America's Minuteman wings. Then it passed close to Whiteman Air Force Base, home to the nuclear-capable B-2 bomber, and then Offutt Air Force Base, headquarters of the Strategic Air Command. Quote, "This path suggests China is gathering intelligence for either a first or second strike on America's nukes," close quote. Should we believe this stuff?
The short answer is no. First of all, you don't steer balloons. I'm sorry, but it's very difficult. Once you launch the thing into the atmosphere, the predominant winds have a bad habit of moving it wherever it wants to go. Secondly, I talked to someone at the U.S. Weather Service, and they told me that the path taken by it was roughly equivalent to where the jet stream goes across North America. That it went over those areas is probably not necessarily deliberate. It simply worked out that way. And again, assuming this thing was collecting intelligence, I have great doubts about that. I'm prepared to believe in many things, but I don't think it can collect much. They have 300 satellites, 100 of which are military. There's no shortage of opportunity for the Chinese to find out anything they want without relying on something like a balloon. And then we haven't even talked about something mentioned in USA Today, which is about the thousands of Chinese in our university and corporate laboratories, the thousands of Chinese who've come here illegally to the southern border. We've had 5 million illegals enter the country since President Biden took over. All of that is infinitely more important. So no, I don't think so. And I think he's discarding the reality that the Chinese were the first to adopt a no first use. And they mean it. And if you look at the structure of their nuclear arsenal, they are not postured to deliver a decisive first strike. They're postured to deliver a certain second strike.
General Stoltenberg said that he thought the balloon was a joint Russia-Chinese operation. Do you know, or have you heard any evidence of that other than Stoltenberg's opinion?
No, I think anything that you hear at this point about these balloons is, you should be skeptical, and that is probably the funniest one I've heard yet. You know, let's spread the blame for the evil balloon around and insist the Russians had a hand in it. Again, the Russians have more satellites than the Chinese. It's just crazy nonsense.
Okay. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, when it happened, President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, Deputy Secretary of State, I'm not certain of her title, Victoria Nuland, we know who she is, we know what she's done in the past, all said the Russians did it. President Putin truthfully said, what are you, crazy? Why would we do that?